Well, thank you everyone for joining us in the latest in the Millennial Insight series. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the Millennial Insight Group. And we're really pleased today to have our guest speaker, Omar Ramirez. Omar is a global workplace expert, a facilitator and a speaker, and he's led workplace design and facilities programs at top companies. So get this, okay? Atlassian, Netflix, Dropbox, Stripe, and Miro. And there's only one of those companies I don't recognize. Today, Omar is the founder of a company called Affordances. And his role is to help companies create solutions for the future of work and place. And I think it's a really interesting talk that we're going to be hearing today. This whole idea that we're moving from workplace to experience and looking at how the role of anyone involved with workplace is changing and evolving. I would love you to put any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll put those to Omar at the end. And thank you very much for joining us. Omar, looking forward to a great session. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to everyone today. Thank you so much for everyone tuning in, whether it's 6 a.m. or 5 p.m. or maybe 10 p.m. where you are. I don't know how time works anymore. Greetings from Los Angeles, California. This is From Workplace to Experience, how the role of workplace and those connected to it is evolving. So why is this question important right now? Like, why do we need to evolve? Well, all of our lives have been irrevocably affected by the pandemic. And not just our lives, but also our careers and our industries have been disrupted by the pandemic, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. And what we want to do through this talk and through some of the work we're doing with our company right now is to help people begin to move forward and begin to move forward into a future. And we want to provide a framework for how we can begin to understand how our industry can move forward. And for those of you in the A&D and interior design community, we want to be able to help you understand how the end users you work with are changing and how you can help them to meet that change as well. So let's jump right in. So who am I? My name's Omar Ramirez. I'm currently located in Los Angeles, California, but I spent the past 14 years of my career working at high-scale tech companies, as Mark said. I'm a workplace leader, a father, and generally I've always been a very curious human being. I actually studied religious studies during college because I wanted to understand better how communities form beliefs and how people come to build community in a way where they're sharing these like specific beliefs and belief systems. And I kind of came into the world of facilities 14 years ago quite by accident. I was managing facilities offsite to put myself through college. And I was also building houses with Habitat for Humanity in the south of the United States, framing houses on my spring breaks. And when I graduated college, I realized I wanted to do something that was at the intersection of community building and physical buildings. And I didn't realize that facilities management was even a thing. My parents had never been in facilities management, et cetera. And so I kind of fell into facilities and I fell into this beautiful world that has now evolved into what we refer to today in many venues as workplace. But it's not so much that facilities has gone away. Facilities management still exists. We just continue to specialize. And that evolution or specialization is something that we're going to talk about a lot today. So what we'll talk about today is the evolution of place and our roles in it. We'll go through the history of what we've seen happen throughout the past 120 years of workplace, why evolution is necessary, why we need to evolve, the evolving needs and expectations of our user groups, and then evolution, not dissolution. How can we evolve instead of becoming replaceable? So where we've been and how we've worked. We will spend probably the least amount of time on this. One, we want to provide a good amount of time for questions at the end, but also I think you're all, as experts in your field, likely familiar with this history. But I want to provide a little bit of context in the beginning. So beginning in the early 1900s with Taylorism, we have this format of the office that is focused heavily on productivity and efficiency. And productivity and efficiency never really went away as something we talk about. You can hear it all the time in the conversations about remote and hybrid work today. However, we, as our physical spaces became more and more complex and more complicated, we came to this point where we began to build beautiful spaces that were also more human. In the Johnson Wax, Frank Lloyd Wright design is obviously an amazing example of this. And I think as we move from the Taylorism into this open office plan environment where we become more complex and more like the design is more considered, we enter this beautiful era of open office planning, and then we get things like the Action Office One, which give us the ability to have better ergonomics, better health for our employees, but also enables us to integrate technologies that are developing and to integrate them into our work life without having to rebuild our office every time. And these developments are, in a way, a very, very good thing, and they're very beautifully designed. But then we see productivity and efficiency come into bear, and suddenly our, beautiful Action Office One looks more like the Taylorism of the past than the office of the future. And we come from this era in the 80s and 90s of the cubicle farm going into the 2000s, and we still have offices that look like this today. It's just the majority of spaces that still look like this today are call centers and places of that nature. But we go into this era, which is what we want to be mostly focused on right now, of the 2000s to the 2020s, or to 2020, I should say, where we have the sprawling open collegiate HQ. And we all well know that Google was one of the first companies to really do that large sprawling HQ in a way that was very considered, but also science-backed, and in a way that enabled their employees to be more productive, happy, and healthier. And those were kind of the focuses. And once you add in the healthier and happier aspects for the employee, it really changes the way we start to look at it, and it takes a more human-centric approach. And when we take that more human-centric approach, we start to change the way we're developing offices. And that's when we really start to develop into the concept of workplace. The term workplace has been around for a number of years now, and workplace experience as well, but we're moving more and more because of the pandemic into this era of a human-centric approach, or a people-centered approach. And, we had this model going into 2020, and then it all ground to a halt with the pandemic. And that's what we want to start to think about from how we can evolve past that point. So we cannot possibly look at the development or the evolution of the office without thinking about how we've evolved roles. Now, in the 1900s, we obviously started off as secretaries and clerks, and administrative professionals haven't gone anywhere. They are still around. There's still tons of EAs and administrative professionals who work on a day-to-day basis. But as our systems became more complex, they developed into office managers, and then we have a branch off into facilities managers. And then as our portfolios became more complex, we began to integrate corporate real estate managers, everyone from project managers to construction managers to corporate real estate portfolio managers into our teams. And these team members became integral parts of the new branches of what is now called workplace. But as our IT systems or our technology systems began to become more complex and become more integrated, we also started to add IT managers to our ranks. And the IT managers have their own branches within AV, IT, enablement, and all these different types of technology we now have to integrate. But every time we had a branch off, we formed another team. We didn't necessarily integrate all this into one holistic vision. And now, of course, in the mid-2010s to 2020, we have workplace managers coming in who are more focused on people and more focused on community and events, et cetera, than potentially the office managers ever really were meant to be. And that's where we start to evolve our roles a little bit further. So the roles and related skills for each of these roles, just to give you a quick overview, all revolve around the physical space. For the facilities manager, budget management, maintenance, move management, vendor management, real estate managers, project management, CapEx projection, construction management, negotiation. These are financially driven, one. And two, they're typically around the physical space. And the fiscally driven portion is something I want you to keep in mind for later on as we start to discuss how these roles could evolve and how it's shifting. For workplace managers, they tended to take on something more human-centric, which was more events, hospitality management, still having that fiscal focus as well, though, which is important, and then internal communications. communicating what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it is definitely more of a human-centric approach than the typical tops-down management style that we were used to in the early 1900s, going into the mid-1900s. So why is evolution necessary? In our practice for the past 7 years as a company, but also mainly over the past year post-pandemic of enabling companies, what we've seen is this very specific move from the CFO to the CHRO team. So moving from the chief financial officer to the workplace team being under the chief human resource officer or the chief people officer. And this is something that was actually happening before the pandemic, but it's something we're seeing be accelerated by the pandemic and by the adoption of remote work and of hybrid work. And that is something that's going to complicate everything for all of us, but in a beautiful way where we get to recreate our future. So just to give you an idea, this is from work from home research from Nicholas Bloom at Stanford. But the pandemic has shifted work in a way where we're stabilizing around 45% of days working from home. This is based on the US overall. So 45% of days are working from home, and a massive amount of companies are now working in a hybrid methodology. We've kind of disjuncted work and place. So when we talk about workplace now in our practice, we talk about work and place, not workplace. And the disjunction of those two things is very important because it enables us to think beyond the physical building and to turn the focus from having the building in the middle to having the human in the middle. Now, the transitioning orgs of going from a CFO to a CHRO org might seem like a very easy, we're just going to transfer under a new leader. It might seem like an easy transition, but it actually has a massive effect on the thinking of a team and the outlook of how that company is going to go in the future. So from a chief financial officer standpoint, everything is fiscally oriented. And I've been on CFO teams and I've been on chief people officer teams before. And when you're on the chief financial officer team, you tend to have a focus of how can we be the most responsible with the company's money, but also how can we advocate for things and spending money on the people side of the company without necessarily getting ourselves in trouble or stepping on the toes of the CFO or making ourselves look bad. And unfortunately, there are some selfish considerations when you're working internally at a company. However, when you're under the chief people officer, your role is to advocate for people. And it's okay for you to advocate strongly to the chief financial officer's team and to your finance team because they're your partners, and it's easier for you to advocate to them as a people-oriented org overall, frankly. So evolving roles, like an experience-led paradigm, and this is what we call it in our practice. So employee experience. So essentially what we say in our practice is we want to put the employee in the middle and all the teams that work in employee experience. So that would be HR, IT, corporate real estate, workplace, facilities management. All of those teams essentially revolve around the employee experience, and the holistic employee experience is everything from your first interview or your first phone call from somebody at that company to the last day you work at the company. And your employee experience is not just made up of things that happen in a physical building anymore. They're made up of how your application works on your phone, that your company has asked you to download, or how Slack works for you, or how the other tools your IT team has given you work, and how the entire employee experience from your first moment you wake up in the morning to the end of your day, how the tools and processes that the company has put in place affect your day-to-day life. And that's something that's really important to think about, because we want to, as we evolve our roles and evolve our teams need to be prepared to provide a better version of this holistic employee experience overall. So when we look at an employee experience-led paradigm, previously in the 1900s to 2020 era, we had this entry-level role called facilities assistants. And in our mindset, the way we talk to teams now is the facilities assistant, their core set of skills was essentially the set of skills that are now specialized skills down here, which is budget management, maintenance, which is preventative maintenance and operational maintenance, move management, vendor management. These were the first things I actually learned when I joined a facilities team. These were the integral skills of getting to know the floor, getting to know the space, understanding employees. But the employees we were seeing companies who are experience-led bring in first have a very different core skill set. And that core skill set is internal communications, program development and management, design thinking, and asynchronous methodologies. So how do we work in a way when we're on more than 3 time zones? We call it the lunchtime problem, but more than 3 time zones where you can't actually find enough time to match up. So you need to use asynchronous methodology to communicate better. So in an experience-led paradigm, we're seeing these core skills become the most vital skills for anyone starting out at a company as a employee experience manager. And then they're specializing into other fields such as FM or construction management or project management. Whereas in the previous paradigm, someone like myself would enter in as a facilities assistant or a facilities team member and then specialize into, over time, employee experience. And so this is actually the complete converse of what happened to me as an employee, which is interesting. And I can see the questions flying in, by the way. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time to address those. I know this is a lot of new ideas. So from evolution to dissolution. So why would we not want to dissolve our teams? Why would we want to evolve our teams? So this is mostly about how we can be of service in this new paradigm. I think there's a lot of fear in our community right now, and we've seen this with teams we're speaking with. And the idea of evolving can be scary. Change has happened, whether we acknowledge it or not. The way that people are using offices, the way that people are using workplaces has shifted. And when you think about the way that people develop habits, a habit becomes ingrained after you do it a multitude of times. And we all have been doing this habit of working from home and working remotely and working in a hybrid manner for a very, very long time now. And so the habit is ingrained. And so how can we evolve our roles to meet the new way that people are expecting to work, or the new way that people will be working? And there's actually an interesting thing that I read yesterday. The CEO of LinkedIn was talking about this, where he was saying that for every one role that is listed as remote on their site, there are 2 applicants. But the more interesting thing was that remote roles on LinkedIn are only 14% of all job listings, but they receive 50% of applications, of all applications globally. So the shift is obviously happening. The question becomes, how can we meet that shift and how can we adjust? So for people who are internalized, for people who are internal workplace team members, making the shift is what we would describe as a 3-step process, which is assess, train, and grow. So for assessing your org, involving your team in discussions and co-designing their future is important. We've seen this happen with a multitude of teams now, where the teams need to change, they need new skill sets, and their manager makes a decision with the executives about a new direction. But the team has never been involved in that decision. And so they have this psychological effect called reactance, where you feel as though your freedom is being threatened, and therefore you resist that change. Whereas if you involve your team in the discussions and have a discussion about, okay, what are your skill sets? What skill sets do we need on the team? And you develop that plan together, they're going to want to come along on this journey, as opposed to having the change thrown upon them. Now, the second step is train and upskill your existing team, with the caveat that we only change titles after. So why only change titles after? Well, we've seen a lot of teams begin to rebrand, as I would call it. And rebranding doesn't necessarily mean you changed anything internally. But the thing we recommend to do first is to actually train and upskill your existing team. This is for 2 reasons. One, you want to retain your existing team and to continue to help the people who have been loyal to your company and who have been working hard for you to upskill into the new roles that you're trying to evolve for them. But 2, it doesn't make any sense to change someone's title and call them something new if they're still doing the old job. And it becomes a bit of a disservice when you say like, oh, well, you're a workplace transformation person now. It's like, okay, well, do I have any new skill sets? Well, no, you're just still doing the same job. It's like, okay, so what if I transformed? And so it's a little bit disingenuous and people will see it coming from a mile away. So we highly recommend that you upskill first and then change after only. The third thing we recommend people do is grow your team. Only once you've assessed your own team and trained and upskilled them or begun that process, then you can start to grow your team and bring on new team members to supplement skills. You might not have the timeline to be able to fully train or upskill your team, and you might be under-resourced in general in the beginning. So if you need to bring on new team members, again, if you assess your org and you develop that plan with your team and they know this change is coming, there won't be a surprise when you bring in a new team member with an amazing new skill set. And if anything, they'll see it as somebody else that they can learn from, and it won't feel like a threat. And in a fiscally conservative time period like we're in right now, because of the way the stock markets are moving, et cetera, and everyone doing layoffs, so there's been over 100,000 people laid off in Silicon Valley at different tech companies over the past year, if you calculate it all together. And in that kind of atmosphere, it can be very difficult to accept change, and we want to help people move through that. So for people who are providing service to these kinds of companies who are going through this paradigm shift, understanding is vital. Your key customer is changing in some ways. You're definitely going to still see customers who are focused under the CFO, but you can begin to assess who your customer actually is by looking at how their team is actually organized. So are they a CFO-oriented organization? Are they a chief people officer-oriented organization? And that can actually begin to tell you in some ways what the focus of that organization currently is. Is it focused on employees retention or employee happiness or employee productivity, or is it focused on fiscal orientation right now? Which, even if you're on the people org, I should say this, you are always going to be fiscally responsible with spending your company's money, but the advocation is different. So existing personas have to be readdressed. This is really important to think about as well, because if you have developed personas of the facilities manager, the workplace manager, the corporate real estate manager, these personas need to be rethought because all of these people's roles are now changing. And there's also many additional roles you should probably be adding. I'm in a 200-person employee, they call it the employee experts group, I think, group, and not a single person in there is called a facilities manager, an office manager, or workplace manager. They are all experience managers and employee engagement managers, and they have a very different set of skills and very different role sets. So existing personas have to be rethought. Clients will be looking for new types of assistance, and I think this is actually a massive opportunity for us in that when the spend transfers from just the physical building into more experience-led services, there's an opportunity for those of us who work in the service industry to provide service to our clients, or the creative industry to provide service to our clients by helping them understand things like experimentation and design thinking and helping them to build those new skill sets. And I think there's a caveat here in that your talent may be recruited away by these companies that you assist. And I'm sure you have all seen this in the 2010s to the 2020 era. I have many friends who used to work in architecture and interior design who are now working internally at technology companies or at software companies or other companies because workplace strategy is being brought internally more and more. But I think it's important to consider this and consider how you retain that talent, how your company also shifts internally, and how you can take a more human-centric approach. So with that, we can take some questions. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm just going to close your slide deck, if I may. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there will be a follow-up email tomorrow with links to the Nick Bloom, to Omar's website. And I've just opened a poll just out of interest, and I forgot to check that you're okay with this, Omar. It's just to find out if people where they report to, because I just thought that would be interesting to see, and I'll leave that running for a while if that's okay with you. But we do have some questions, and you may have spotted them. But let me start off with the first one was Griffin. With your roles and responsibilities, Griffin's interested in where you feel occupancy planning, change management, and strategy fall into place.
Yeah, so change management and strategy and occupancy planning definitely, I would say, fall into the people org. I think it's an interesting thing that you would see happen at scaling companies a lot is they would have a very hard time quantifying how many people they're going to hire and when and where. And mostly because that tends to be a moving target at these scaling technology companies. So I think it definitely falls under what we would call an employee experience org. I think in the end, you have to think about how that team is structured overall and who the actual leader of that overall team is. We've seen, I think Atlassian's a good example of this, where their team now reports into the work from anywhere, head of work from anywhere, who used to be, I think, the head of remote at Facebook. But that work from anywhere team or now actually has workplace experience reporting to them. So it's interesting to see where these teams actually report into.
Great, thank you for that. I don't know if anyone knows that facility management actually first got its term at a meeting at Herman Miller, and the IFMA actually first came out of a meeting, and that was actually because of occupancy planning, and they were managing the facilities as the furniture is where it got its terminology from. So interesting. So I always say, how does the client needs factor into this shift in focus?
Yeah, I think the client needs are absolutely changing. I think in the end, we've been working with a number of teams over the past year, and the things they're asking us for are not so much because many companies aren't actually ready to change their physical space, or they're not ready to make a large move. The thing they're mostly asking us for is help with facilitation, with having those hard conversations, and with helping them understand experimentation. That's why we kind of focus on design thinking a lot, because that experimentation thing is actually people don't really have a very good understanding of how to do that. How to set up an experiment, how to measure an experiment. The measuring is usually where we see things fall off. And frankly, as the person who asked the question before brought up, change management. The thing that we always see, and I used to see this all the time, get cut from scopes first was always change management. And it's like, no, the change management is the thing that helps you drive it forward. And the response we would always get from people is, oh, well, we'll just have someone internal do it. It's like, okay, so they have 50% of their time for a whole new role. That's excellent. That's good to know. Yeah, I think it does affect the kinds of services they need on an org by org basis. This is different globally, I should say, as well. So in the United States, we're actually seeing what we would consider, and we've talked about this before, a hyper regionalization of different places around the world. In that the United States used to operate in a very specific way, and Europe used to operate in a very specific way, country by country. Whereas now in the United States, even we're seeing San Francisco operate extremely differently than Los Angeles, which operates extremely differently than New York. When you think about work from home, remote, and hybrid, and the percentages are just very different depending on the types of industry that's there.
Okay, then that leads directly. I'm going to ask Rosie's question now, because she's asking, have you ever seen any, are you starting to see global differences as well? Because Rosie's based in the UK. Are there any cultural differences, do you think, in the way that these roles are playing out?
Yeah, I think, actually, interestingly enough, so we kind of went from facilities management to workplace experience. And now we're kind of making, I think, that final transition into experience. I always see that progress is not one of those things. You don't really start where someone else is. You start where you are as a company. So a company that has a facilities management team isn't going to immediately just go and switch to an experience-led paradigm. That wouldn't make any sense. It'd be a massive change management. So we're seeing companies that are globally, like when we were doing a project mid-pandemic in Asia Pacific, in Japan specifically, we saw a greater acceptance of the idea of working in a hybrid manner in Tokyo for the first time with a company. And that was very surprising to us, in that, Tokyo tended to be, from the design of offices, a very hierarchical structure and a very in the office presenteeism structure. And to see that team moving into a hybrid manner was interesting. But we're seeing, if you look at Nicholas Bloom's research, actually, he has some interesting tidbits on this, where you see the percentages shift slightly from the US to EMEA, and from EMEA to APAC, you see, again, a slight shift in the percentage of adoption of hybrid work from home and remote. Lower percentages in Europe and APAC as opposed to the United States. But I think that often in work paradigms, Europe affects the US and the US affects Europe in interesting ways. So we are seeing a number of teams in Europe adopt experience-led paradigms as well. And a lot of the employee engagement specialists we work with are actually in Europe.
Thank you. Ryan asks, how can workplace teams democratize the workplace so all stakeholders, from executives to individual contributors, have an opportunity to influence workplace strategy and design?
Man, the democratization of the workplace, boy. I think that the way we've done this in the past is by, well, I guess there's a way we've tried to do it in the past, which is surveying employees, building the voice of the user, or the voice, what we would call actually technically the voice of the customer, right? Because in the end, the employee is the customer of the workplace experience or the work and place teams. And That didn't necessarily work as well as it could have, because we would hear the voice of the customer and then we would take the business priorities and dollop them on top, and then we make a decision based on the needs of the company. And I think there is that question of the balance of the business, the needs of the business and the needs of me as an employee, and which needs really win out. I think democracy in the end is about having a voice and having a say in the way the company moves. And I think it's much easier at a small scale startup where you're 20 people and you're all invested like in somewhat equal portions in the company besides the founders, and you all have this equal voice. As you grow into a 10,000 person company, I think sometimes the best we can do is to build a structure for employee feedback and for user feedback and make it user centric, and then advocate. It becomes the role of the workplace team and the HR team, or if you're an employee experience team, you have both those teams working together to advocate for the needs of the employees to the executive team. You become the voice of the customer to those executives, and you're supposed to, advocate for their needs based not only on what they're saying, but also based on the research that you're doing outside of your own company. You need to be looking outside of your company and understanding the research that's happening, because in the end, it's hard to argue with a proof of concept and economic facts. And that's typically how we advise teams to think about it: is you build up that voice of the user, the voice of the customer, and then pair it with information from the outside and expertise from the outside, so that you can build a strong case and help your CFO or CPO understand the needs of your employees and why they're based in facts and not just feelings.
Yeah, and if I could, the term democratize the workplace often is a little confusing, because in a democracy there is always an unhappy group of people because they've been outvoted. So for me, what we've started to use this term equitable, where you make it fair, because democracy for one group of people is not fair for another group of people. So it's a kind of an interesting term to use. Matt asks, many CPOs, which I think is chief people officers, and people who are looking to get into workplace experience have been adopted point solutions. I'm hoping you know what that means. If you don't, I'll ask Matt to clarify. And are surprised when they don't get the results they want. How do we get teams to adopt a more holistic approach and understand the value it has to organizational health?
Oh man, so yeah, desk booking solutions. Desk booking solutions they're a complex subject. This is where the complications come in, I think, with desk booking. And this is I was a space planner. I don't envy anybody who works in occupancy planning right now. And this is that desk booking is actually kind of the reason, because employees want to, if you're going to ask employees to come into the space, employees want to have their own dedicated space to come to because that's what they're familiar with. But they don't want to have the friction of having to book a desk if you don't have enough desks for everybody who's coming in at the same time. So I think the adoption of those kinds of tools has to be done in a very delicate way, because it depends on what your company's current standpoint is. Are you asking people to come to the office 5 days a week and also book a desk? Or are you asking people to come in the office 3 days a week and also book a desk? And what kind of friction are you introducing into your life? And what kind of system are you using to do that? I think the other thing that is kind of a confusion here in the industry is the bar is much lower than you would think. And I say this to people a lot, and they're like, "What do you like? What, like the bar's in the basement." In that some companies just aren't ready to adopt technologies like sensors, like desk booking and things of that nature, because up until the pandemic, they may have still been doing space planning in an Excel spreadsheet. And that's the reality of a lot of companies, is they haven't invested in technology in decades. They're so far behind that they need somebody to help kind of bring them along that journey and understand how this technology could be beneficial to them and how to use it. So if anything, I would recommend creating advocacy teams. And I've seen a number of prop tech companies do this and solution companies do this, creating advocacy teams to help educate your end users who have not adopted technology yet, and enable them through education in order to be able to understand why your technology would be helpful to them before you try to sell it to them, if that makes sense. So desk booking is such a complex subject that it can seem sensible to somebody who creates the solutions that why wouldn't they want this? It just makes so much sense if you look at the aspects of this and the ratios of this. that person who's the internal person might be a one-person office manager for a 100-person company, and they are under-resourced, stressed, and don't have time to investigate technology.
Yeah, and I often say, actually, we live in an echo chamber sometimes. We talk to each other about these amazing workplaces, and the people that should be on this webinar aren't on this webinar. And that's often a challenge, is that we always kind of pat each other on the back, and we're not supporting those that they don't have time to join events like this. That's the trouble, because they're too busy sorting out all the problems. Sarah says, excellent presentation, Omar. Totally agree. But she does ask, can you give guidance to experienced workplace managers on how to best advocate internally for the shift to the people departments in an organization?
So just to clarify, Sarah,
what's the sales pitch?
Yeah, what's the sales pitch? Well, I guess, are you under a finance org right now, Sarah?
Carry on. I'll see if she puts it in the chat.
Yeah, I think that has to be.
No longer was the answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think, the experience-led. So I've seen this happen in one of two ways. Typically, when you are under the finance org. Wait, so I guess the question, or how do you advocate for spend to the finance team from the people org? Or is it how do you move over?
Yeah, how do you sell the idea of moving to the HR team?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that I've seen people do this before, advocate for it, if you're the experienced leader of the team, typically I've seen this happen in one of two ways. The one way is it gets told to you that it's happening because the chief finance officer, the people-led problems that you deal with on a day-to-day basis become too complex, and they become a factor when you're honestly just interacting with the chief people officer more than you're interacting with the chief finance officer. And if that's your direct reporting line, suddenly you get changed over because it just makes more sense from a business perspective. But if you want to advocate for it, you can build a business case by looking at who you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis, who your main points of contact are, and the majority of the work you're doing, and building an actual business case based off that. Because if all of your points of interaction are your main points of contact within your community of your company are people who are reporting to the chief people officer, and that's the majority of your work is people-focused work, then yes, you should be under the people org, and you can start to make that business case and start to advocate for that to the chief people officer team and the chief financial officer team. Now, you might not report directly to the chief people officer. You might report to a VP of people, et cetera. And so that's going to be a little bit different, but building a business case and understanding how to build business cases is the best way to get anything, I think, resolved internally. And obviously then, of course, understanding the social dynamics of your company and the paradigms that are in place, so you don't, frankly, put yourself at risk, because sometimes rocking a boat can be a good idea, and sometimes you should know when to not rock the boat. I always say be bold and audacious, but also think about yourself, because you are human and you probably have human needs like a house and warmth. So
yeah, you have to pick your battles, I guess.
A little bit.
Yeah. And it is interesting that everything you've talked about I've been in the office furniture industry for over 35 years. And at one time, people visiting showrooms to make decisions were procurement and the design team, and maybe, the real estate team. That's changed over the years. More IT people coming because they've got to manage all the tech around the workplace. And then we started seeing facilities, strangely, who often weren't in those tours. The people who got to manage it from day to day being in it. And now we're seeing HR teams come around it, or workplace experience people, as some of them are now being.
Yeah.
Cool. Hassan asked the question, what workplace experiences are currently being employed successfully to facilitate, encourage people to develop a more balanced hybrid experience between home and work?
So a more balanced, you mean like splitting time 50-50? Is that what you mean by balance, Hassan?
Waiting for a response there, but some people have left, so it could well be that he's disappeared. But for me, it's about being in control of balance is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think the balance, I've seen a number of companies employing different avenues to try to I guess I should say, entice or attract employees back to the office for a number of reasons, or a number of stated reasons. I think in the end, the hybrid environment and the employee experience, or creating a good experience for a hybrid environment, depends a lot, frankly, on technology and what kind of technology you're integrating into the stack, because you want to understand when your teams are going to be in. And I've seen a number of different technologies for this. Calvin, which comes out of Australia, is one of those technologies. Cafe is another one for scheduling and understanding like the social dynamics of your teams. But there's a number of good technologies out there for actually coordinating team schedules and understanding when people are going to be in, because that's the most critical factor. Whenever you're asking someone to come into the office, and when you're asking someone to come into a space and to gather, you have to ask, why are we coming together? What are we going to be accomplishing? When are we doing it? And like, who's going to be joining? Because we all agree to come in. There's also that social aspect of, if I agree to come in and Mark agrees to come in and Debbie agrees to come in, but Mark doesn't show up, Mark has kind of violated this social contract. We're like, well, we all came in, and you're like, no, well, actually, I'm currently at home. So I think there is that aspect of it. And like, it starts with technology is a great thing, but we also recommend that teams actually, to create a better employee experience and get people together, you start with those team agreements, and you start at that like team level by writing it out on paper or writing it out in Miro or whatever system you want to use. Those team agreements, if you agree on how you're going to be working, when you're going to be working, why you're going to be working, that enables people to actually make the decision together to when they're going to come in. And then you can start to, as a team of workplace experience team, enable experiences that will meet the needs of those people, because you're going to know when they're going to be coming in. You know that Wednesday or Tuesdays are your peaks, and that's when you want to be deploying events, and that's when you want to be creating these great experiences. But enabling people through technology and reducing friction enables them to make decisions more easily and enables them to come in more easily.
I do like that idea of getting a team agreement. I have a guy that facilitates meetings, and often when I know a guy, and he often starts the meetings with, how are we going to agree to run this meeting? What are the rules, kind of thing. Yeah. And I do quite like that idea, so that there is an understanding.
Yeah. There was a company I worked at once where you basically get handed a one pager from each person you work with. It's like the document of, this is how to work with me.
Wow.
Because this is how I work. And it's like, oh, great. And then you get to hand them your sheet and be like, this is how I work. And like, now we find the mixture in between. It's like, I don't take messages from this time, or I have a kid, or what those parameters are. And like, understanding those people is important.
And Avery and Nico both cover the issue of technology. What role would tech play in employee experience? And also, it feels like digital and collaborative tools haven't evolved much since workplace was separated. What's the most important innovation or development you've seen in this area? And you mentioned one tool I heard, but can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think that this is actually the most exciting time we've ever seen in workplace, and I think that's because of the confluence of the amazing amounts of technology that are being developed, the incredible, if companies like Apple just released this thing called Freeform, which is essentially like a whiteboarding tool for your iPad and iPhone. It's in 16.2 in the new iOS. If companies like that are starting to think about how to collaborate digitally, then like we're in a really, really good place for like seeing some really cool future technology. But I think that technology plays a massive role, and we don't integrate the technology teams enough within our employee experience teams. And not just from a perspective of what tools are we using to manage the physical space or the day-to-day operations of an employee, but how does something like Slack integrate into that? And how does something like Zoom or the video chat tool we're using integrate into that experience? And understanding how that technology stack forms a holistic experience in of itself. That's your digital experience. So if you're the employee experience advocate, you should be helping to enable that technology and helping to understand how it's going to affect your employees on a day-to-day basis. So technology plays a massive role. I mean, Calvin's a good example. Cafe is a good example of like technologies that are meant for, Calvin's a concierge app. Cafe is more of a social interaction and employee scheduling application. Obviously, things like Miro and Figma being widely used and widespread are fantastic, because you think of them as like an infinite whiteboard. As a designer, I think of them as that infinite white table you see in every studio ever, where you're like putting down finishes and you're missing obviously the feeling of textures, etc. But I've seen people do meetings in VR and AR now, where you have those materials available, and you start to see those that interaction point, that's a bit of a ways off, but we are seeing people start to implement VR and AR implementations, which I think is very exciting. It lacks a little imagination still. We could use some more creativity in there. Um, but I think that we are at a point still where we need more information and more education within our community to educate end users, to bring them up to the new level of experience-led paradigm before we can start implementing some of this technology at a widespread level. So like education leads to a greater adoption of technology, and we want to help enable that as well.
Thank you. And Mark Goodray, thank you for this question. I think we were discussing about this earlier, so we were sounding like we were talking about a representative democracy. How might we enable a true Republican, e.g. each employee has freedom and agency to choose?
So unlimited flexibility. I think that there would be a few things that would have to happen for us to enable that truly. And I think there's one is the question of flexibility from where they are now. And then there's the greater question of flexibility to go wherever they want. There were some interesting conversations that happened early on when some of these companies announced unlimited flexibility for employees, because, you know, the immediate question becomes, okay, how do we track taxes? And like, I have some friends who work in HR, in like specifically HR at large scale companies, and they're like, we have no idea how we're tracking taxes for this. We have no idea how we're tracking employment law for this. Like, someone decides to go to Mauritius and spend 60 days in Mauritius, and all of a sudden we have a tax bill that we didn't know existed because someone's tracking an IP address. There's a lot of questions around that I think need to be resolved before we can provide unlimited flexibility. But I think, you know, I think there's the ideal state of we allow every employee to work the best way they can. I think that to get to that ideal state, we need to provide better training for management to understand how to manage people in that avenue before we allow employees to actually work in that avenue. And so I think it comes back to a management question of how can we retrain our managers to have the skill sets for asynchronous working or developing team agreements and things of that nature, and develop better learning and development programs for those managers. And that's a critical thing that needs to be done before we can provide flexibility. Because if you give someone flexibility and you have a bad manager, they're going to manage them badly, and then they're going to leave the company.
Yeah, and I always think sometimes we confuse anarchy and autonomy. You know, anarchy is that freedom, no boundaries. Autonomy is freedom, but there are boundaries. You know, there are still rules and guidelines, and
yeah,
the American term you use guardrails quite a lot.
I think having very apparent boundaries is important, though. Like having specific boundaries. It's kind of like the idea of unlimited vacation. Sounds great, but if you don't know where the parameters are, there's people who are going to go over here and take way too much, and there's people who are going to take none and burn out. And that's what we saw at companies like Netflix, where they first implemented these things. Is some people took 0 days, some people took 40 days. And you need guardrails. You need to have like a minimum vacation requirement. You need those guardrails to understand.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question from Julian. Thank you, Julian, for this. What role has the office location played in the occupation experience? We're seeing a flight to quality environments in town by occupiers rather than fringe or out of town location. Does this relate to what you're finding?
Yeah, you know, flight to quality is an interesting, and I would love to know who comes up with these terms, because they become so ubiquitous so quickly. Like, you think there's somebody just sitting out there. It's like the person who writes color names where they're like, it's tranquil pond. It's the flight to quality. They're just the same person. I think flight to quality is an interesting thing because, yes, people want to have a good experience when they're coming into their space. I think the physical workplace still has a role to play. I think those spaces just might continue to change and adapt and look much different. And for a company that's like remote first, those people are still getting together somewhere eventually. It's just a question of, is it a space they own, or is it a flexible space that is, you know, operated by a third party and they come to on an occasional basis? That seems to be the bigger question. But for people who are, you know, still occupying and having their own in the hybrid world, the physical space still plays a massive role. And if anything, the quality and the experience has to be much better, because if you come in on your 1 day or 2 days a week where you're expected to be in the office and everybody starts coming back and it's a shit experience, you're probably going to be less inclined to come back the next time. So you want it to be a good space, you want it to be a good experience, and you want to reduce the friction points for them as an employee. And you want to enable that experience to be a good one. And that's why we see that flight to quality, because the expectations are higher I mean, think of it from the aspect of all of us working from home right now. We're all on Zoom. We've all suddenly have good lighting. We suddenly have good cameras. We suddenly have quiet spaces. We suddenly have like our nice backdrops and backgrounds. And it's not just because I do talks. We have these setups now, and we understand our individual needs more closely than ever. And now the employee experience teams need to find a way to capture those needs and understand them as well. So when your end user is more educated and understands their needs better, it makes your role more challenging as well, which is, of course, difficult for employee experience teams, but I think it's a good challenge.
Yes, we're coming towards the end of the time, but I'm going to drop a bomb for you. I love this one from Kate. What's your biggest fear regarding the future of hybrid?
Ooh, my biggest fear about the future of hybrid is that we do exactly what we've done previously, and this is a very human thing to do, is to center on productivity and efficiency, and you can see it in the presentation if you go back, and it's like the Taylorism to cubicle journey. You know, we had this beautiful vision of what could be, and we made it about productivity and efficiency. And we kind of did this in the 2010s and early 2020 era, where Google had this very like research-backed, beautiful idea of space, and people just copy and pasted it. And then we started to go into the idea of densification. It's like, oh, well, what if we make the desks 5 feet? What if you make the desks 4 feet? Nobody uses their desk, make it 4 feet. And it's like, no. And then, of course, COVID hit, and suddenly you need 6 feet of space between everybody, and your paradigm's gone. But I think that's my fear, is that we do what humans do when we try to optimize things. There's nothing optimal about creating a great experience. It becomes something that is human and something that is quality. I don't know if there's anything optimal about a good restaurant or a good third place or a good coffee shop. I don't know if a beautiful, comfortable coffee shop, and I'm sure you're all picturing one in your head now, that place you go to when you have a wonderful cup of coffee and you sit and read a book and you have a wonderful experience. I don't know if there's something optimal about that experience or optimized about that physical space, but you know it's a good experience. And my fear with hybrid working is that we do that thing we do as humans and try to optimize and productize this experience and make it a bad one.
Omar, thank you very much for a fantastic session. We've got lots of questions, and I can share them with you. But thank you everyone for joining us today. And Omar, thanks for a great session.